What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Steelers Breakdown Podcast. This is actually take number two because right in the middle of my previous recording, Brandon Aiyuk signed an extension with the 49ers, a 4-year, $120 million extension that will keep him in San Francisco. Steelers miss out on Brandon Aiyuk. So let's talk about this. Lots of thoughts on my mind, lots to say, and I think lots of learning for what is the Steelers' new front office. First of all, I admire the pursuit of star wide receivers by Omar Khan. He shot huge. He shot big. He asked about the stars of the league. Talk about DK Metcalf. He asked about Brandon Aiyuk, Debo Samuel, all these guys that are really high end receivers. He asked about them and was turned down, but Aiyuk was the one that stuck around and he kept in it. Obviously, it didn't work out. In free agency, the only guys that they were really super interested in, Mike Williams, a high-end talent, uber talented guy despite the injury history. Tyler Boyd, but they didn't want to pay Tyler Boyd what he wanted at the time. And then when they drafted Roman Wilson, they really weren't interested in that anymore. And so you look at how this kind of transpired, and from the moment that they traded Deontay Johnson, they were looking for a guy near his caliber. They weren't looking for a Josh Reynolds. They weren't looking for a guy like that who they could have signed back in free agency. They could have signed Josh Reynolds. They were looking for a guy up near Deontay Johnson's level to pair with George Pickens. And if otherwise, they were going to spend on the cheap and try and invest the money that they had in other areas of the team. They traded Deontay Johnson for Dante Jackson. That's an area they did. They paid Patrick Queen a lot of money, and they weren't gonna address this wide receiver position as much as they could have, probably because the wide receiver room in Arthur Smith's offense, having two very good wide receivers obviously means a lot, but doesn't mean everything. They'd rather invest in the offensive line in the draft. Don't blame them for that. But I do think the process by which they went about this wide receiver room is flawed. And so you really look at it. I mean, you traded away a player that was naturally going to be a guy that maybe held out, wanted a new deal. You're talking about Deontay Johnson as a guy that they thought they needed to trade. That was their thoughts from the get go. They felt like they had to trade Deontay Johnson. And so they did. But that doesn't mean you can't fill that void. And it doesn't mean the Steelers wide receiver room is going to completely suck this year. Roman Wilson, I think, has upside and could be really fun. But if the room of Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin III, Roman Wilson, Scotty Miller, and maybe Brandon Johnson gets you amped, I don't think it should. George Pickens is going to be a really good player this year. He's going to be great. I think he might take that leap to become that bona fide one. But man, he needs some help. You need some help. And so we'll kind of see where this ends up going, but I do think that this wide receiver room is probably not going to be very good. I think naturally. And I think you can blame Omar Khan for going about this where he shot very high and the rest of the room was signed probably, to be a wide receiver three, four, et cetera, et cetera. And now it just looks pretty underwhelming. It does. And so the Steelers this year are going to have to be efficient. And with the offensive line injuries, with Isaac Seumalo being banged up, Troy Fautanu being banged up, this is significant because the Steelers better be efficient in the head of the chains because they're not going to be able to win much on 3rd and 10, 3rd and 13. It's not going to be something they do. They're not going to be a prolific passing offense. And so I think you can blame Omar Khan for not addressing this position. There were opportunities. There were opportunities to get a very solid low end to high end three, like a Josh Reynolds, that could have been fine. They passed on the entire second wave of wide receiver free agents as well. And so there were opportunities to get a big bodied guy that could block and go with George Pickens. Mike Williams, Josh Reynolds are the two that really stick out to me. They shot very high. Instead, what they're going to have is what they're going to have. And so I think there absolutely deserves to be criticism here. When you traded Deontay Johnson, and they were going to trade him regardless, so it didn't really matter. He was getting moved. But by doing so, you knew you were going to open up another hole. And if you go back to the offseason, what were we talking about? Tackle, center, linebacker with Cole Holcomb's status. You needed probably a wide receiver anyways. You probably would have added a wide receiver maybe later, but you probably needed one. Corner, safety. These were positions we were talking about all draft season and free agency. And the Seahawks did address them. Dante Jackson, Deshaun Elliott, Patrick Queen, Troy Fautanu, Zach Frazier, Peyton Wilson, all these guys. And we talked about quarterback, Justin Fields and Russell Wilson. So they did address these positions, but wide receiver and I think slot cornerback kind of got left on the wayside as a result. Now, maybe slot cornerback you as addressed because Cam Sutton, but I think there are legitimate conversations to be had there. But maybe you just created one too many needs. And so the next point that they could upgrade this position is going to be at the trade deadline. Now, are they going to be good enough at the trade deadline to make that move? We'll see, but there might be a chance to add somebody from a team that is struggling. Maybe, a team that didn't uh, think they were going to struggle. Maybe you can go out and get a guy on an expiring contract and address this position. But really, the true long-term solution probably won't come until 2025. And so that could happen in free agency. That could happen in the draft. That could happen in a lot of different areas, but that's where it feels like. And it feels like the process by which they have gone about evaluating and addressing this wide receiver position, it is a little flawed. They've shot for the moon. And when you shoot for the 5 stars and the high 4 stars, sometimes you get shot down. And that's what this really feels like. Omar Khan's done a lot of positives. I think a lot of those moves we mentioned are really good moves that have upgraded these various rooms across the roster. I think this is an overall stronger roster from what they had when they went to Buffalo last year. But there are absolutely concerns in that wide receiver room. There are concerns across the roster. There are still concerns. Injuries have popped up and nestled some of those concerns. But there are concerns from roster construction. I think that wide receiver room is one of them. I think it's just going to be hard to get a consistently efficient, successful passing game. I don't think they have the guys there. Roman Wilson could be that too by week 10 or week 11 too. I mean, that's possible, but when the first 8 games he's not because he missed a month with an ankle injury, I mean, that's tough. That's tough. And so the process by which this has kind of been carried out, I think, is where you can really hammer down on the Steelers. Brandon Aiyuk would have been a home run move. But sometimes you don't always need the home run. And that's really where I think this comes into play. There is a clear void at wide receiver. Clear void. And they've put in resources to it. They've signed Scotty Miller, they signed Van Jefferson, they drafted Roman Wilson. It's not like they didn't address it, but they didn't address it entirely. They only addressed one part of the problem. And so now there's a long-term issue there at wide receiver. And so you're going to have to get somebody in the offseason, trade deadline, whenever. But it's the most obvious hole on this football team right now. And so I think you can, when you go into a room that, like I said, is George Pickens, Van Jefferson, Calvin Austin III, Roman Wilson, and Scotty Miller, man, there's reason for criticism there. That's not a good wide receiver room by any measure. And yes, they have weapons elsewhere. Pat Freiermuth is going to be good. Pickens himself is going to be great. You're going to rely on Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, and I get it. There's weapons on offense. But you had the opportunity to get better wide receivers than what you have now. That wouldn't have cost a lot, and you would have had the cap space to make the moves. And so I think that's where this comes into play for me is the process by which, shooting for the stars when maybe you're not in a position to shoot for the stars is where you can really criticize this. And so I think there's significant concern about this wide receiver. Even if I think Van Jefferson's been better this summer than I thought he would be. I think if he was a wide receiver 3, I think you would feel very good about this room. But now he's your wide receiver 2. You're going to ask him to block a lot. Van Jefferson has, he's a willing blocker, but is he really a great blocker? I think there's questions about that. And so I think there are legitimate questions to have in this room. And so they miss out on it. I think it's probably one of the first lessons that we can see with Omar Khan. Omar Khan has done a nice job as general manager. The process by which he's added things to the roster have been solid. But I think in this one, I think his process was a little flawed. And so they're going to go into probably the regular season with a weaker wide receiver room than you wanted. There's really no trade candidates out there anymore that are naturally going to boost your team. And so you're going to have to either have to wait to the trade deadline or address this in 2025. All right, folks. Thanks for listening to the Steelers Breakdown podcast. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, turn on the notification bell for more. We'll be back tomorrow.